I guess the other thing that we've seen in this war is the return of the siege mentality. You know, Israel, CNN reported that Israel, they called it I want to just quote exactly what they said. They called it a complete siege of Gaza. Israel ordered a complete siege, cutting off food, electricity, fuel, and water supplies. Now, that's something we haven't really heard before. We've seen different types of warfare emerge over the last several years. We have sanctions that are levied against people so that they can't access their accounts, right? Russia, there's sanctions on them. There's sanctions on Iran. There's sanctions against other countries, and that has had some modicum of success. We've read about cyber attacks, and as we become a more computer-dependent people and world, cyber attacks can disrupt airline schedules. It can disrupt just about anything you mean, and there can be all these attacks that happen in that way. We have different kinds of warfare that have happened that are different names. They don't kill people, but we've seen these things happen. But here we have this siege mentality that Israel has thrust upon Gaza. And when you read the reports, it's beginning to have its effect. It is amazing when you think about it that governments have such control over us that all the basic necessities of life they can switch off with just the flick of a switch. If someone wants to flick off our electricity, they can do it. They want to cut off our food supplies, they can do it. They want to kick off water supplies. We're all dependent on the water companies for what we do. We are a people, the world is a people that can have this happen to them in a very successful way. And you know that in times past, sieges worked. That was the way of modern warfare. Cut off the supplies, the people will either starve to death or they will capitulate and give in. And so we see this mark of the beast and the punishment that the mark of the beast could wield, not just in buying and selling, but even in all these other things that we have become used to. It's hard to imagine life without electricity. It's hard to imagine life without fuel. It's hard to imagine life without turning on a faucet and having water there. But all those things could happen. All those things could happen, and the people in Gaza are experiencing that. Don't know if they expected it, but they're experiencing it. Likewise in Guatemala, in the feast, there was no bullets flying in this protest. There was no threat of human life, but these blockades that were set up in all the cities around Guatemala, and it wasn't just one city where the feast was, but every single city, from what we have been able to determine, in a political protest over a contested election, that these blockades were set up. People can't get in and they can't get out. There was even a threat early on about food supplies being restricted to force their will upon the government. Now that seems to have eased a little bit, and talking with them yesterday, food doesn't seem to be an issue. It's just you can't get in and can't get out, some of the people that are remaining there. But the siege mentality has entered the world, and it can have an effect on you and me, and it tells us those possibilities of things that we take for granted that could just disappear with the flip of a switch because someone doesn't like what you think. Or as your country, they don't like what you stand for. So we see this siege mentality, and we see it in the Bible as well. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 20. God talks about sieges. Deuteronomy 20. I'll just read verse 12 in Deuteronomy 20. God talks about as they're going to enter into the promised land and these cities that they come and they're going to conquer with. He says, if you go to the city, offer them peace. Offer them peace. Verse 12. But if the city will not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And this is how you can have them yield. You have control. Besiege it. You've seen, I'm sure, the movies, the ancient movies, the story of Masada, the siege that occurred there and what that resulted in. In Deuteronomy 28, we see sieges as part of the future again in a very graphic, and I'm not going to read the graphic words that are there. I'm going to let you read some of the verses intervening here in Deuteronomy 28. But in Deuteronomy 28, God says, if you obey me, these are the blessings that will inure to you. But if you depart from me, this is what's going to happen to you. Let's pick it up in verse 47. Yeah, 47. Because you didn't serve the eternal your God with joy and gladness of heart, for the abundance of everything, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the eternal will send against you. You will serve them in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and in need of everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you. The eternal will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which doesn't respect the elderly or show favor to the young. What type of people is that? And they will eat the increase of your livestock, the produce of your land, until you are destroyed. They won't leave you grain or all of these other things. Verse 52, they will besiege you at all your gates until your high and fortified walls in which you trust come down throughout all your land. And they will besiege you at all your gates throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you. And then he goes on and he describes some very difficult images as he warns us what will come about as a result of the nations turning from God. In Zechariah 12, second to last book in the Old Testament. Zechariah 12 and verse 2 talks about, of course, Zechariah we know is a prophetic book. And in verse, I'm going to go ahead and read 1 because God continues to recount who he is, that he has control, and the words that he says are sure to happen. The burden of the word of the eternal against Israel. Thus says the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. In that time that will come, when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. In Luke 21, it talks about when armies surround Jerusalem. It's no longer the Jews who are in control of Jerusalem at that time. It's the armies of the world who have taken control of it. And God says, when those armies are there, it's time. It's time. The time is near. Those things we can begin to see the buds open. The fruit will be there pretty soon, whatever time it is. I'm not setting any dates here at all. God will have that tree in full bloom, and it's our job to be ready for that time. Now, I want to draw your attention to one story of a siege that shows the power of God and his deliverance, because, again, some of the things we talk about when we talk about those prophecies can look like, wow, how will we survive it? How will it happen? Well, God can do anything. Let's turn back to 2 Kings 6. In 2 Kings 6, we have a siege against the people of Israel. And chapter 6 comes on the heels of the story about Naaman and the healing of him from leprosy when he just does what God says for him to do. Comes on the heels of the story where a man loses his axe head in the water, and that was a very valuable instrument at that time. And then God allows that axe to float so the man can recoup it. And in chapter 6, we see the siege. Let's pick it up in verse 24. It says in verse 24, it happened after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his army, and they went up and they besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and indeed they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. In a time when food is scarce and a siege is there, food becomes very valuable. Might remind us of that third horseman, right, in Revelation, when all this food costs a whole day's wages because it has become so scarce. How does it become scarce? Anyway, a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver and 1/4 of a cab of dove droppings for 5 shekels of silver. Then as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." Not going to read. You can read verses 27, 28, 29 there and see what goes on there. It's a terrible thing to think about, that any human being would ever be put in that situation, but how desperate they become in a time of siege. If I drop down to chapter 7 and verse 1, Elisha, the prophet, said, "Hear the word of the Lord. God says, tomorrow about this time, a seah of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Here they are in famine. Donkeys' heads are selling for this inordinate amount of money, but Elisha says tomorrow morning, basically grain is going to be like free for the taking. And so an officer on whose hand the king leaned answered the man of God and said, "Look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could this possibly be? Come on, what are you telling us? You want us to believe that we're starving to death here and doing unspeakable, unthinkable things, and then tomorrow there's going to be food in plenty? Could this thing be?" And he said, "In fact, you shall see it with your eyes, but you, because you doubted God, will not eat of it." And so if we drop down to verse 6, we see what God did. Here the Syrians are besieging it. And in verse 6, God, whose thoughts are far above our thoughts, his ways are far above our ways, things that we can't even imagine, he does know, and we can't even in our hearts even begin to think, just like the Israelites could not possibly have thought of the Red Sea opening and them passing through it to safety from the pursuing Egyptian army. Look what God does. The Lord caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, the noise of a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us." So they arose and fled at twilight and left the camp intact, their tents, horses, and their donkeys, and they fled for their lives. And so there is these 4 people out there who see all of a sudden the camp just empty and all this food everywhere. And so they go out and eat it, and indeed, it is exactly what God said. The next day, grain was there for anyone who wanted it. The lesson: always have faith in God. Things may look bleak, things may look tough. Always have faith in God. He promises he will deliver. He promises he will see us through. Always have faith in God. We may not know how, we may not know when, but we know his promises are sure.